Hey guys, what is going on? It is me, Mr. Mario, and you might be wondering, Mario, why are you wearing this hat at this time? Well, not only it is cold outside, it is literally 3 degrees Fahrenheit outside, which for everyone who's outside of the US, that is 16 degrees Celsius. But it is really cold, and also I just felt like being a bit festive for the year. And look at it, it's awesome. It's Rigby's head. So yeah, I decided to kind of go all regular show for this. But this episode of Gaming Goofs is not brought to you by Regular Show, and it is not about Regular Show. In case you all don't know, you don't need to see the previous episodes of Gaming Goofs if you haven't seen them, but over the summer I started this series called Gaming Goofs, where I took at first all 3 major companies that are out right now in the gaming world, so Nintendo, I almost said Sega, it's not Sega, that's what I'm doing right now. Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony, and then I made separate episodes on each one covering the good things they did, the bad things they did this generation, and you know, the generation to come. Then I analyzed all the next-gen systems, and then I finished it off at the time with the console that I'm going to be getting first for, you know, my next-gen choice. But I wanted to come back to it, and coming back to it, I wanted to talk about Sega. Because Sega is kind of near and dear to me when it comes to some games. Like, some of my favorite consoles are Sega consoles. Some of my favorite games were, you know, Sega games. So first off, I want to say, with arcades, you know, yes, I'm talking about arcades, you know, those things where, can you believe that to play video games before, you had to leave your house, and you had to go to a store and pay money to not buy the game, to play the game, and every single time you died or whatever, you had to pay more money. Yeah, arcades, those old things, in case if you haven't been to one, I feel really bad for you, because they were pretty awesome back then. But back, you know, in the 80s, 90s, Sega had the arcade market on lock. Now, yes, you know, you had Konami, you had a few other companies in the run, but if you went to an arcade, more than half of the cabinets or games were Sega. They had the Sega logo on them. And that's just because Sega was able to get that whole area on lock. They had that whole market on lock, and they did really good things with that. Unfortunately, well, we all know what happened to the arcades. They're pretty much non-existent now, aside from, you know, Chuck E. Cheese's and maybe, I don't know, one other around. But those are mostly kids' games and all that. Like, you're not going to have adults going to arcades primarily anymore. So, with the rise and fall of arcades, Sega kind of lost that competition, unfortunately, and they lost that lock they had on arcades, which is disappointing because, you know, it's bittersweet because, you know, the thing was more convenience. Like, you could play a game at home, pay for it once, and you don't have to keep putting quarters in there, but then, you know, you don't really go to the arcade, arcades are going to shut down, all these different things. So Sega ended up losing that whole market. But I want to talk about, you know, their games and their consoles. Now, first off, my introduction to Sega with consoles, home-based consoles, was the Sega Genesis. I myself got into consoles real late in the game. I was one of those kids who, it was okay for me to play on the computer, do some games on there, but my parents did not want to get me a console because they thought that it would rot my brain. I ended up getting my first console when I was like 8 or 9 years old or so, but I remember when I was either 10 or 11, I was over at my cousin's house, and I ended up finding this Sega Genesis there. I ended up hooking it up, and he had a few games for it, but the game that really stuck out to me was Sonic and the Hedgehog 2. And I still love that game, to this day, of course, but I remember I played it, and I played it when I was there, and then eventually, you know, they just ended up giving it to me. They're like, well, we don't use it, and you really like it, even though you have these new systems for some reason, so here, you just take it. And that was fantastic to have. I absolutely love that. But going into it as well, even before that, this is before I owned a Sega system, I knew about the consoles, and Sega was for gamers, but not just for gamers, for everyone, they were a household name. And by that I mean my parents, my teachers, people who didn't care about video games, knew what Sega was. And they could probably tell you at least 1 or 2 Sega titles. They knew what Sega was, they were familiar with Sega. I remember when I was in 1st grade, This is when Sega, I was 7 at the time I want to say, Sega ended up announcing their bankruptcy. And I remember my mom told me, of all people, as I said, we didn't have a console in the house, but my mom was the one who told me that Sega went bankrupt. And I remember for some reason there was some substitute teacher one day, and I don't know why, I was 7 at the time, I don't know why I shared this, but I was talking to him and I was like, hey, did you hear that Sega went bankrupt? And he was like, yeah, I heard about that. And it's like, if a teacher knows, like back then, if a teacher knew about a game company, then they were huge. That was it, they were huge. Like when it came to gaming really, Sega was, the name Sega was almost as relevant as I want to say, you know, Microsoft is to computers. Like everyone knew who Sega was. Everyone knew what Sega did. So they were going bankrupt at the time, and that was, I want to say, I don't even know what, I want to say that was what, 1999 or 2000 or so. That's around the time it happened. Yeah, actually that sounds about right thinking about it, but yeah, they end up announcing their bankruptcy, but what I want to do is kind of cover what led up to that. So first off, the Sega Genesis. Now I'm not going to be covering the Sega CD, well not the Sega CD, I will cover that, but I'm not going to be covering the Sega Master System, just because it kind of came and went, and it was a nice, I want to say it was a nice, you know, system to get the product out there and all that, and they were able to gauge what they wanted and really perfect it for the Sega Genesis, which later came out. Now, at the time, the Sega Genesis was competing with the Super Nintendo and had some real fierce competition. They ended up finding, and it was games, you know, specifically like, you know, the Sonic games and such, games that were really, really fast. It was games that ended up, games like that ended up really pushing the sales, pushing the marketing on there, and the main marketing thing was blast processing, and Sega does what Nintendo don't. Now, if you've seen any of these commercials, it will show, you know, the Super Nintendo being all slow and having these slow-paced games like RPGs and Mario Kart and all these, while as you know, the Sega has real intense games with a lot of lighting and, you know, real fast games like Sonic the Hedgehog on screen. Well, I will say the blast processing thing is pretty much BS, in case you don't know. I'll cover it like this. If you put up the specs and everything of the two systems, the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, and compare them, the Super Nintendo is better in every single way except for the CPU. The CPU, this is a fact, the CPU on the Sega Genesis is slightly faster than the Super Nintendo. However, everything else on the Genesis, the Super Nintendo does better. So the Genesis, the only thing that is better on it compared to the Super Nintendo, I'm talking about, you know, sound, resolution, color depth, everything. The only thing that's better is the CPU, just barely, but people didn't really care about that back in the day. There were some people here and there, yes, but they made it sound cool, and they said blast processing, because, I mean, hey, you can't dispute the fact that, it's a fact, you can't dispute it that the Genesis does have a faster CPU than the Super Nintendo. So, logically, for somebody who doesn't really know that much, they would think that the Genesis is a better console, and they're selling it with blast processing. Now, the Genesis was really a good contender, and it was, you know, selling through the roof, and it was really competing with Nintendo. But the problem was, Sega would not let the Genesis die. The Super Nintendo came and went, and then the Nintendo 64 was out, and Sony entered the market. Sony was actually, it was great because Nintendo was actually wanting to compete with Sega with their Sega CD. In case you don't know, the Sega CD, it was expensive at the time, but it was this CD-based add-on that you could link up to your Sega Genesis, and then you could play a whole different variant of games. You could play, you know, disc-based games, and you had better sound, you had better graphics, you had full motion video, stuff that you couldn't accomplish with the cartridge, with the Genesis alone. So the Sega CD was a real good idea at the time, and Nintendo knew about this, so we said, okay, Sony, listen, we need you to help us, we're going to contract you, and you need to make a CD-based system with us. Pretty much there were disagreements here and there. Sony didn't like the contract they were in, so Sony just said, you know what, Nintendo, it's been good working with you, but we're Sony. We can make our own system. And that's exactly what happened. The PlayStation 1 was born in 94, 95, I want to say. And then Nintendo 64 was out. And then you had this Sega CD that was out. Now, the Sega CD, it did have a few good games here and there, But the problem was, the price on it was too expensive. I don't remember the exact price on it, but it was, I want to say it was just as much or even more than the Genesis. And Sega was trying to, it was an add-on, but Sega was trying to tout it as a whole new system, which it really wasn't, because you are relying on the previous system in order to get this to work. Because you can't run a Sega CD by itself, you just can't. So, what ended up happening was, they were trying to tout this system, and the Sega CD was just not selling. And it was because there was no killer application for it. Yes, there was Sonic CD, there were a few other games on it, but there was nothing that really made you go out and get the system. There was no, you know, for example, the Super Nintendo, you had the Super Mario series. For the Genesis, you had Sonic 1, you had Sonic 2. You had those legendary games at the time. By the time Sonic CD came out, yes, it was good, but it's like, you know, is this really a console seller? Do I really want to drop like $300 getting this and Sonic CD? Like, for that, do I really want to do that? When I could, you know, get the Sony PlayStation, or I can get the N64. The Sony PlayStation, it was a 32-bit system, and the 64 was, of course, a 64-bit system. Hopefully I'm not messing up anything on there. Now, what ended up happening was, then with that, Sega said, oh great, technically, we do have a disc-based system, but the software is not that good. I mean, just seriously, look at some of the old Sega CD games, like, full motion video games were bad. They were bad. Like, really bad. So it was understandable no one wanted to get them. So then Sega said, okay, this is what we need to do. We need to make a 32-bit system. But let's not, you know, no, let's not make a whole system. Wait, we still have the Genesis, right? Can we still add on to it? Let's do, we're going to make an add-on that you're going to plug onto the top of the Genesis, and it's going to change it from a 16-bit system to a 32-bit system, and we're gonna call it the Sega 32X. Well, the Sega 32X came and it went. In case you don't know, Sega 32X, as I said, it plugs onto the top of the Sega Genesis, and it takes different styles of cartridges, but it takes 32-bit cartridges as opposed to 16-bit cartridges. The problem was, again, first off, it was an add-on. Second, it wasn't a very good add-on. Third, the Genesis was dying already. Like, it was dying, and they just released an add-on because they didn't want to make a whole new system. But fourth, of course, not the last but not the least, the software was, not only there was almost no software for the 32X, like, there was less software than the Sega CD for the 32X. That's saying a lot. There was less software. But not only that, the software was terrible. It was bad. I want to say there was one Sonic the Hedgehog style game on the 32X, and it was related to Knuckles. I don't know the game off the top of my head, unfortunately, but, you know, if you haven't heard of the 32X, this is why. Because it wasn't a good add-on, and it was an add-on that didn't have very good games on it. So, the 32X died. It was very, very short-lived. And in short, the problem was Sega did not want to move on. They didn't want to put the research and development and time and resources into a whole new system after the Genesis. They thought that the Genesis still had all this power and they were just going to upgrade it and upgrade it, add on and add on. Well, here's the thing. Consoles are consoles. They are not PCs where you could go in and you could upgrade them every few years. You just can't do that with a console. You have a console, when it's done, you get a new console. When that's done, you get a new console. You don't upgrade them. Sega was trying to do that is what it seemed like, while all these other companies were, you know, doing whatever they were. So what ended up happening was then, I want to say in 96, 97, I might have the date wrong on there, but I want to say, no, honestly, I think it was, yeah, it was around then. Sega ended up releasing the Sega Saturn. And this was a whole new system. It was going to be awesome. It was to compete mostly with the PlayStation, but it was also going to be competing with the Nintendo 64. Now, in case you don't know, it was very powerful at the time. It was this whole disc-based system. You could even add on more RAM to it because there was a cartridge slot in the back. It had these games like Panzer Dragoon, Virtual Fighter, all these other games. and it could really stack up to the PlayStation. Well, from a glance it could. Here's the problem. It was a development nightmare. That was it. SEGA pretty much, they thought very simplistically and advanced at the same time. And what I mean to say is they accomplished quite an awesome feat at the time. They ended up putting 2 CPUs in the console. Two different CPUs. Not a dual-core CPU. I'm talking about 1 CPU, 2 CPUs in the system. Their logic was more, well, the PlayStation has 1 CPU, so we're going to put 2 CPUs in here, and we'll just be more powerful. So, blast processing, the reincarnation of it, right? They end up putting that out, and the problem was, first off, the thing had 8 processors in there. 2 of those processors were CPUs, but it had, the sound processors, it had the video processors, it had all these things, and really none of them were made specifically for the Saturn. More or less, SEGA went out and they contracted with companies like Hitachi, for example, made the CPUs. They said, hey, you guys can make CPUs? Okay, do this. Hey, you guys are making the sound processors, right? Well, what processor can you, wait, you can fit that in here? Okay, cool. We're gonna want about 10,000 of those in this. Okay, you video processor, what do you got? This looks good. Okay, put that in the Saturn. So there was really nothing proprietary Saturn exclusive on there was the problem. And due to that, because they had, this gangbang of all these different processors from different companies that were supposed to be doing different things, of course they didn't work out very well with each other. So if you can imagine to put it nicely, I guess, the Saturn was just a complete mess. It was a complete mess on the inside. But at the same time, it was really something to be admired because, a system with 2 CPUs at the time, I don't know, that's still impressive to me, but, it's only as good as the programmers, just like a calculator is only as smart as its user. I mean, you can have the best calculator in the world, but if all you can do is add and subtract, you're only going to add and subtract with that calculator, and that's essentially what happened with the Saturn. It was a development nightmare, so there were a few companies that were able to manage them properly, like for example, it was mostly the in-house studios, but Panzer Dragoon was done great on there. Yeah, Panzer Dragoon, that's a series. That was one of my favorite series on there. There was no Sonic game on there, I'm going to get back to that in a bit, but Virtua Fighter, it was a 1v1 game, and each character was controlled by and manipulated by 1 CPU, was pretty much rendered off that, so they were able to handle that properly, which was real awesome to see. But there were also other games that were being ported, and porting games was a nightmare, and there were some games that only utilized 1 CPU, because the companies were saying, we can't, we programmed the game for 1 CPU, we're just porting it over, we're not going to try and rewrite the whole engine for 2, no, we're going to do 1 CPU because that's what makes sense right now. So it's really one of those things, what good is 2 CPUs when nobody's making use of both of them? It's really not that good. Now, again, the Sega Saturn, it was plagued with the same issue. It didn't have a killer application on it. It was supposed to have a really awesome Sonic game on it. I believe it was supposed to be called Sonic Extreme, and even before that there was another Sonic game, but that ended up getting canceled. Shenmue was also on there at one point, but that ended up getting canceled. But Sonic Extreme, this is a whole nother video I can make, because it's really interesting following the development process on there. But Sonic Extreme, it was pretty much handled from developer to developer, studio to studio, group to group. Several of the developers ended up dying, they got sick, and it was just bad luck all over. Even one story I'd like to share with this. At one point, SEGA, every time they came in, because it was SEGA of America and SEGA of Japan. Now, SEGA of Japan, they weren't working on the game. It was SEGA of America that was working on it. What ended up happening was, at one point, one of the teams had a build of Sonic Extreme running, and it was not good. And SEGA of America, one of the head honchos, said, listen, no, you keep doing what you're doing. You, make a whole new team. I want a new game right now. Start making a different version of Sonic Extreme. So this was supposed to be the good version of Sonic Extreme, right? Now what happened was, as a surprise visit, the head honchos of SEGA of Japan ended up visiting the studio. This was a last minute thing, and everyone is hurrying and all that, and they don't know what's going on. Now, the first guy who had the bad build of it, he knew about it a bit before the other team who had the good build of it. What ended up happening was the good team found out last minute. So they're scurrying to, you know, get the build up and running and get it playable and all that. While they're doing all that, SEGA of Japan comes in and they said, we want to see this game right now. The game we're funding, we want to see that right now. So this guy, the first guy, he's just like, okay, well, here's Sonic Extreme. It was bad. It was bad. And pretty much what happened was, right as they left the meeting, they said, you guys aren't doing anything. No, we're not supporting this game. You guys are done. We gave you all this time, we gave you the money, and no, this game is terrible. As they found out, as he was saying that, you know, the guy who had the good build, he came and he said, hey, I have the build, this is it. And they said, oh, well, we just watched this guy's build, your game is terrible. And that must have been really disheartening, honestly, for developers. But honestly, I feel like that game would have come out if we saw that second build, if Japan saw that second build, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So there was no killer application for it. Games were getting canceled here and there, but the marketing was terrible. The marketing was bad. Now, SEGA had not had a good marketing since the original Genesis, not the 32-bit, the 16-bit machine. They had not had a good marketing since then with their blast processing, because they went through the Sega CD, they went through the 32X, there was also the Nomad, which was a portable Genesis. They also had the Game Gear, which was pretty lackluster for a handheld back in the day, just because it guzzled through batteries and the screen wasn't that good and all this. But those were two other systems that, you know, really weren't that popular, so Sega tried to go into the handheld market. They didn't go in, but going back to the Saturn, first off, the launch of the Saturn, I want to say it was '96. Now, they had one date in mind, specifically. They had one date, and they were toting that as Saturn Day, and it was supposed to be awesome, and it was going to be great, and the stores were going to sell out, and they were selling out of pre-orders, and everyone was going to be lining up around the block to get this new Saturn. And what ended up happening was the president at the time of SEGA of America, he came out on stage at E3, and this was May, and he ended up saying, hey, so this is our console, the Sega Saturn. And we know it's coming out in 3 months, but guess what? You can go to your local retailer and pick up a Sega Saturn right now. So, thinking about it, you know, that sounds pretty awesome, doesn't it? Now, think about it in today's terms. What if, you remember when E3 was going on? What if Sony came out and they said, hey, you know, we got this PlayStation 4, it's an awesome system, you can go out and pick it up right now. Wouldn't that seem cool? Well, it wasn't as cool as it seemed. First off, retailers were infuriated. Infuriated to the point where they said, no, we're not even going to sell the Saturn. No, you know what? We're not supporting you anymore, Sega. We are not selling your games or your consoles or your accessories anymore. No, ship these back to the DCs, either liquidate them or sell them back to Sega. That's it. Then the companies that did house them, the retailers that did sell the Saturn, well, think about it like this. What good is a console if there are no accessories out and if there are no games out? All the companies that were developing games were supposed to come out, you know, as launch titles for Saturn Day, not 3 months earlier. I'll put it like this. Games do not go gold. I'm talking about final retail product. Games don't go gold until, I want to say, the earliest I've seen a game gone gold has been maybe 5 weeks before it was supposed to retail. 5 or 6 weeks before it was supposed to retail. So you're telling me 12 weeks before the system is officially supposed to come out officially, people are still working on their games. There were several companies that said, you know what, screw it, no, we're going to take some more time to make our game. Other companies said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to comply to your standards. We're not releasing the game. So there was a huge backlash, and I'll pretty much put it like this. They did this in order to outsell the PlayStation, to get a jump start on the marketing. They were out 3 months, at least 3 months ahead of the gate as Sony, I want to say. I don't know when Sony came out specifically. I want to say it was sometime in September of that year. But what ended up happening was Sony, their PlayStation ended up outselling the Saturn easily within the first week or two, something like that. And the Saturn had been out for months ahead of the game. But you pull a stunt like that, you're gonna piss off a lot of retailers and game developers, and that's exactly what happened. Let's go ahead, flash forward a year later. Imagine you're a kid, you just got your brand new console, alright? This can apply to you now. You just got your brand new console in, let's say, Christmas. Let's say December you got your new console, alright? And this might not have been 97, might have been 98, but you know, let's say you got it pretty recently. You got it for Christmas, you're really happy, you know, you're playing your games, telling all your friends about it, everyone's coming over to each other's houses, playing systems, you're happy, everyone's happy. Then E3 comes along. You can't wait to see what's going on at E3, right? SEGA of America, the president comes out, and you're just like, oh god, okay, I can't wait to see what they're putting out on the Saturn. He comes out and he says, the Saturn is not the future. Let me just repeat that. The system had been out for about a year, maybe two, and the president, not a critic, not your best friend, not a developer either, the president of SEGA of America comes out and says, the Saturn is not the future. It is not our future. So it's like, great, so you're pretty much telling me that this system's dead, right? So all that excitement you had is gone. No more excitement anymore. Developers, well, they're not going to produce games for a system that isn't the future. So they start porting their games over to other systems. Or they stop developing them for the Saturn. Retailers, well, hey, thank you very much for telling us, SEGA. We better start liquidating all the SEGA merchandise, liquidating all the Saturn merchandise to make room for the PlayStation and the Nintendo. And SEGA came out and said, it is not the future, and this was pretty much the death of the Saturn. I don't know what happened to marketing for those few years, but it's really unfortunate to see, because Saturn just fell over so badly. And it really affected, you know, their entrance into the generation after that as well. This is where they started to get back off on their feet, but the next system that came out was the Dreamcast in 1999. Now, it would have been better to, you know, announce the fall of the Saturn at about the time of the rise of the Dreamcast, but Sega didn't want to do that. Now, first off, the Dreamcast was an awesome machine. I'm not knocking. In fact, it's one of my favorites. It's one of my all-time favorite consoles. I love the thing. It had great backing on it. It was a good console to develop for. It had awesome games. It had a good controller. It was a powerful system. It had interesting concepts at the time. It was perfect. It introduced, you know, keyboard. For example, this is a little feature that not many people know of. One thing between PC gamers and console players, they say, oh, well, you know, I don't like keyboard and mouse. PC players, I don't like a controller. Well, Sega actually ended up releasing many PC games on the Dreamcast, and they also released keyboard and mouse accessories, which meant you could use a keyboard and a mouse, like just a regular keyboard like this, well, a Sega Dreamcast one, but you could play the game on your TV like you would on a computer, which was real impressive at the time. It also had, you know, the web browser. It had Sega Online, which was actually introduced in the Genesis, but, you know, we see the Sega Channel wasn't that popular at the time, especially with dial-up. And this is about the time when, you know, the US was starting to go over DSL broadband, you know, at the turn of the millennium. Now, the Dreamcast. Where can I start on this? First off, I don't know what happened to the marketing, but the marketing was fantastic on it. First off, the date was perfect. September 9th of 1999. All nines. It was supposed to be the day of the Dreamcast. They went all out with advertising. No expense, like they didn't have any, they didn't cut any corners on advertising. They're advertising everywhere. If you didn't know what video games, this is what I'm talking about at the beginning of this video. If you didn't know what video games were, if you didn't know that much about games, you knew what the Dreamcast was. You knew what Sega was because of their awesome advertising. And then the system came out and it had awesome games on launch. Awesome games coming out. It had this online feature. It had amazing accessories. Just the best stuff. And it was kind of, I like to call it in my head like a dual gen system. By that I mean, it had several games because this is at the time when the turn of the millennium was coming around, but also the PlayStation was getting old. The Nintendo 64 was getting old. The next systems had to come around. This came right between the new systems. So it came right between, the old systems and the new ones, which the new ones were going to be the Xbox, the PlayStation 2, which was inevitable, of course, and the GameCube. So this came out about a year beforehand, and this actually really helped out the system. Now, excuse me everyone, I just had to make that cut real quick because for some reason my camera decided to cut the footage right there. But anyways, as I was saying, having that system come out earlier was a major marketing success on the system. It was coming out before everything else, but then what ended up happening was the PS2 came out, and I'm not trying to make this sound abysmal because the PS2 is one of the greatest systems ever. But the PS2 came out, and what happened was it had a DVD-ROM drive in it, which meant that games could now be on DVDs, which meant higher capacity, longer games, better graphics, better sound, all this, but it was also a real good marketing move because DVD players were new. At the time, this is when VHS was getting phased out. And just like the PlayStation 3 came out for $600 when Blu-ray players were over $1,000, it was the same thing at the turn of the millennium. You could get a DVD player for like $500 or get a PlayStation 2 which played CDs, DVDs, PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 games for about $300 because it retailed at $300, which they really hit the nail on the head there. So the Dreamcast was honestly about as powerful as the PS2, but the problem was, one problem right there was, DVD playback. It didn't work. Finally, the big thing, and this is one reason why, game developers, they've always been against piracy, but this is one reason why developers cite piracy, and they really poke at it a lot. The Dreamcast, unfortunately, died pretty early on because of piracy. One thing with SEGA was this. Most companies do this when consoles first come out, but they say, we're going to sell the console at a loss, that's cool, we're going to make up for it in software sales. Well, the Dreamcast has notoriously been known for being the easiest system to play pirated games on. This is a really interesting engineering look on it as well, because I love looking into it, but the Dreamcast games were not on audio CDs. They were not on CDs, like compact discs. They were on a specific type of ROM called a GD-ROM, a gigabyte disc ROM. So these games held about a gigabyte or 1.1 gigabytes of content, which was real great, and they couldn't be read by a typical CD drive at all. The problem was, there was a broadband adapter that came out because the system ended up shipping with a regular, 56K network adapter. A broadband adapter came out, but also people ended up homebrewing their own coder cables, which allowed them to use the Dreamcast itself to dump the game over to their computer. While dumping the game, or even after dumping the game, they were able to decrypt the game, and from there even shrink it down to the point where it was less than 700 megabytes, or they could split it, but it was less than 700 megabytes most of the time, and it could be burned over to a traditional CD. Now, when the games first came out, when they were first hitting the scene, when they were being pirated, Utopia ended up coming out, and they released the Utopia boot disc, because games were not self-booting. But that wasn't an issue. All you had to do was burn off this boot disc, and what you did was you popped the disc in your system, and it would run the disc. Now, what happened was when your system loaded up that Utopia boot disc, with it deep within the Dreamcast BIOS, there was a type of boot method that allowed you to boot up milled CDs, which milled CDs were another slight variant of the CD. They were burned onto regular CDs, but it was more for like CD text things, and I believe they were used lightly on some other systems as proof of concepts. But SEGA ended up putting that originally in their Dreamcast BIOS, and then I guess they kind of just put it on the back burner, which was a really bad idea, because what happened was the Utopia boot CD ended up activating that part of the BIOS, and it said, listen, a game is going to come in here, it is going to be a mill CD, go ahead, boot that. So what happened was, once it booted up, all you had to do was pop out the boot disc, put in your game, close the tray, and then it loaded up right there. So you literally had to do like a 1-minute swap, and that was it. Aside from that, you didn't have to do any complex swap tricks. Because let's be honest, burning one CD and swapping it is not complex. You didn't have to like hold down anything. You didn't have to do a bypass. You didn't have to open up a spring, anything like that, like you did on the PlayStations. You didn't have to do anything like that. You can make your own boot disk. You didn't have to open up the system. You didn't have to install a mod chip, which, coincidentally, installing a mod chip is actually a very bad idea on a Dreamcast, due to the fact that mod chips were made so that you could play games from other regions because the Dreamcast was indeed region locked. However, if you installed a mod chip in your Dreamcast, you could not play any type of CDs. You couldn't play CDRs at all, which meant you could not play any backups that you burned on the Dreamcast. So there was that just a little issue. So honestly, it would have been more viable to just, if you really wanted the import copy, you buy the copy, and then you can go ahead and get the image of it online and burn it over and then play it from there. Because if you were playing, that was the funny thing, the Dreamcast was region free if you ran it off a CDR, but if you were doing a GD-ROM, no, it was region locked. So what ended up happening was, even later on, nearly all reliant booting games, like disk swap boot games, were changed up later so the code would be self-bootable, meaning you could boot it up the same as a retail game. You put the disc in and it would play. That's it. Easy enough, right? The only problem was, since these games were compressed down and such, many times audio was ripped out, audio was downsampled, video was downsampled, textures were downsampled, things like that. To most people, it didn't matter, because they just wanted to play free games. But to people who wanted to really enjoy the games to their full extent, who wanted to support developers, anything like that, they didn't like that as much. Although you could have a backup on hand, which is nice because you want to preserve the other ones. This really led to the demise of the Dreamcast, because, let's be honest, even back then, burning CDs was expensive. My first CD burner, I remember my dad and I, we picked up one day, this is when I was in first grade, so this is 99, 2000, and it was 2000, yeah. This is the Napster era as well, but we ended up getting an external CD burner, which you're already going to pay more for anyways. So an external CD burner, it was a 4X burner, and we paid $200 for it. And discs were about $1 a piece, let's say. But think about it like this. Games retailed for $40 at the time. So, more than likely, let's say you want to have about 10 games in your Dreamcast collection, right? Well, let's think about it like this. We're going to go with the most expensive one, an external burner at the time, $200. So, for the same price of 5 Dreamcast games, you could get an external CD burner. And then, for your discs, you'd be paying, let's say, let's be generous, $2 a disc. So, I mean, math it out right there. If you're just one to pirate, get some free games, it was worth it for you. This is also when, because of this, at the time, CD burners and such were getting more and more affordable, but they were still rapidly going down in price because there was so much competition, because there were so many companies out, because there were so many discs out. So they just kept dropping in price, and this led to Sega's demise, because Sega said at first, we're going to sell the console at a loss so we can get it out there, but we're going to make up for it in software sales. Once the system was exploited so easily compared to others, because for others you had to do hard mods, you had to do more complex swap, you had to do other things, or if it was a cartridge like an N64, you really couldn't pirate it too well at the time. Because of things like that, Sega was not selling software, and that led to their demise. And in 2000, 2001, I want to say, they ended up filing for bankruptcy. And that was the last system that came out. Since then, they ended up selling off their intellectual properties and such to several other places, and Sega's still not doing too well. I mean, look at it. Like, when was the last classic, good classic Sonic game, or it's a good classic, any type of Sega game to come out? Probably have to backtrack a bit. Last console out was the Dreamcast, and I mentioned this earlier briefly, but one reason why people were a bit hesitant with the Dreamcast at first was because they'd gotten screwed over so many times from Sega, Sega said, oh, the Sega CD is going to be the next gen thing. No. They said the 32X is going to be the next thing. No, it wasn't. They said the Saturn is going to be the next thing. Well, do I have to repeat it? I'll repeat it again. The Saturn is not our future. The Saturn is not the future. So, if you've gotten screwed over by the same company at least 3 times, you don't really want to go back. So a lot of people, that kind of led to Sega's demise as well, a bit early on. What ended up happening was later, Sega actually wanted to make a second Dreamcast, and they worked with Microsoft a bit. Now, it didn't come to fruition or anything, but the original Xbox was pretty much the Dreamcast 2. Did you all notice how similar the controllers were between the two? Have you all noticed how many Sega exclusive games came out on the original Xbox? Quite a lot, and it still carried over. So Sega kind of still lives, but aside from that, they decided to back down. They said, well, listen, the arcade market's dead. We shot ourselves in the foot multiple times with consoles. We're just going to stick to software, and software hasn't really been that lucrative. Honestly, the one thing they're still really holding on to and will not let die is Sonic, and there's no real good Sonic games that are coming out. Like the last amazing Sonic games, original Sonic games that came out were on the Dreamcast. Now, yes, Sonic Generations was an amazing game. I personally loved it, but that is because it was pretty much what the fans asked for, which was a current generation 2D side-scrolling game with a few other things in there, not deviating too much from the original formula, and just having overall fun. But the problem was, the reason why I'm saying it's not a real original game is due to the fact that it's a formula we've seen before. Sonic Adventure, that was a completely different thing. So, and also Generations was a rehash of classic Sonic levels. So it was a real big bout of nostalgia as well. So looking back now, that has been the painful history of Sega, and they've messed up so many times. They really have, They went from being a household name and being king of the arcades to filing for bankruptcy and being the kings of pirated games for their systems, unfortunately. Even for other systems, for example, the Sega CD, all you had to do was burn over an image file and you were good to go. But that was this is in the mid-90s, when CD burners were not popular at all. They weren't household products at all. And even with the Sega Saturn, all you had to do to play a pirated game was do a little swap method, which is actually harder than the Dreamcast swap method. Or you could install a mod chip in your system, which was very, very easy to install. But Sega consoles pretty much became the poster child of this is what happens when gamers pirate. And then their software library went downhill. It was not very lucrative at all, but that's what happens. Anyways, this has been a look back on Sega, where they've goofed up here and there, and unfortunately I really can't do a future episode of this because I know they're not going to be coming back. They will not come back to the market anytime soon. We saw, right now we have 3 big contenders. We have Nintendo, we have Microsoft, we have Sony. Where is their room? With an already crowded market, where is the room for a Sonic game? Where is the room for, a Sega exclusive Sonic game? Where is the room for a Sega console? There is no room, unfortunately. And even with all that, it's sad to see, it really is, but you keep messing up so many times, that's what's gonna happen. Anyways, this is Mr. Mario, signing off. Thank you for watching, everyone, and long live Sega, I guess we can say.